welcome to the launch party for Nevi'im, Book 3 of the Post-Self cycle. I'm the author, Madison Scott Clary, and while I wish I could have pulled together a live release event, this was the best I could manage after being out of town for a while. So, what is the Post-Self cycle? Well, the idea actually sprung up several years back in a discussion with a bunch of friends about what life would be like in a world of uploaded consciousnesses if you could create a copy of yourself from a moment in time and let the two copies diverge, potentially being able to share their combined memories down the line. This was the birth of one of the core conceits of the post-self universe, forking. Taking its name from software development, where one can fork a project, that is, make a copy of it, make a change, and then merge those changes back into the original project, forking grew from laughing about how much we'd get done to an actual, honest-to-goodness, written-down system. This led to a small open universe project with several of those friends, where we wrote short stories using various aspects of forking and other world-building bits to explore the concepts. This was fun for a little while, spawning several short stories, a twine game, a brief ARG, though eventually we all moved on to other projects. Fast forward a few years, and one of my other projects, following a character stuck within her mind after a malfunction in her immersive technology equipment, was starting to flag and feel incomplete. While working on Post-Self, I had written a longer story, Kohelet, that similarly felt like only half a story. While both my original story, Exocortices, and Kohelet were both nearly complete, I reworked them from top to bottom, slowly weaving together the two strands, and thus was born the book, Kohelet. Kohelet follows R.J. Brewster, a sound tech for a modern theater company in London, as he navigates the balance between doing work he helped pioneer, living a comfortable solo life, and spending time delved in on the net, using immersive technology to interact with others as her avatar of an anthropomorphic fennec fox named Aude, a corruption of her chosen name as a fox's muzzle might say it. One troubling thing about this life, though, is the slow disappearance of people online and this growing concern of the lost. People who seem to be stuck in an online mode even when disconnected, their minds wandering and their implanted technology showing them still connected. Sure enough, after digging into information on one of their friends who wound up lost, RJ's world crashes down around him in the middle of a rehearsal, and he wakes up in a truly solipsistic world, stuck in a place of no time built of memories and dream stuff. Fast forward 2 centuries, and Codrin Bălan receives a message from an enigmatic anthropomorphic fennec fox going by the name Dear Also the Tree That Was Felled, a member of the Ode Clade, a group of forks from a single individual, Michel Hadje, who all take their name from the 100 lines of a poem. Dear, it seems, needs some help finding someone who shared a bit of information, a name that only the Ode Clade should know, something they guard jealously, and it would like Codrin to help with both the investigation and to pull the end result together into a coherent story. Kohelet came out in 2020, and at that point, I didn't foresee any further story taking place within the universe. It was a good enough book, it netted a Leo Award, and I was proud of having written it, and somehow managing to port a twine game into a paperback through creative use of typesetting. 2021, however, was my year of mourning. In the span of 8 months, I lost 6 friends to various causes. Combine that with working in an industry that prides itself on chewing up its employees, and my mental health started to crumble. I found myself on short-term disability. I had all those memories of friends built up inside of me and nothing to do with them, so I just started writing. In the span of 5 weeks, I'd written 150,000 words, and Toledot, the sequel to Kohelet, was born. In Kohelet, the only things we really know about the system, that vaguely named on purpose Uploaded Consciousness Project, is that it started on the early 2100s after the saga of the Lost, and that the hardware lived at the Earth-Moon L5 point. Nothing about how it got there, nothing about its relationship to Earth, nothing about how it ran. Toledot, then, teases that apart a little bit more. Starting 10 years after the foundation of the system, as the founders work toward the goal of seceding from the political systems of Earth so that they can act on equal footing with the rest of humanity. At the core of this movement is the Council of 8, a loose decision-making body on the system that interacts with both the system engineers and the governments on the physical side. Michel Hadje, however, is tired. She can't seem to keep herself together, with her very form wavering between the human body she inhabited before uploading, and the furry avatar that had very nearly replaced her concept of self after so long within the subculture. She receives permission from the council to fork off 10 instances, one each for the 10 first lines of the stanzas of a 100-line poem, and take a break. These instances all wind up focusing on various topics, but the only time I know my true name is when I dream, just true name for short, winds up focusing on this individual rights effort with another council member, Jonas Anderson. Aided by a counterpart back on Earth, Yared Zarezgi, they work towards secession. 200 years later, and a new separation is happening. A 20-year project to build two smaller versions of the system, Castor and Pollux, to launch out of the solar system comes to fruition. Douglas Hodge, the launch coordinator, has been obsessed with the system since learning about his distant relative, Michelle, and her role in the early days, so it was a natural fit for him to help out. Codrin Bălan and her forks, Codrin Bălan, on the two launch vehicles, have been working with his system-side counterpart, May Then My Name Die With Me, of the Ode Clade, to construct a history of the launch project and its parallels with secession, and it's starting to get concerning seeing so many of the same names between the two stories. Sending two vehicles out into space at fantastic speeds is a perfect opportunity to check for extraterrestrial life, though, right? It may take them hundreds or thousands of years, but the chances are greater that way. The powers that be may not have liked the idea of including the Dreamer module in the array of scientific instruments, but in the end, it was included. Toledot was another instance of me accidentally writing myself into a sequel. You can't include something like the Dreamer module, end on an epilogue of one of the astronomers receiving a message and just not write another book, right? And so here we are. Nevi'im has arrived. I'll be reading a short sample from the book, the first chapter. Tycho Brahe, 2346. Convergence, T-minus 22 days, 13 hours, 35 minutes. It took Tycho Brahe what felt like an age to remember Codrin Bălan, and then it took him a panicked age longer to remember that, yes, sensorium messages were a thing, had been a thing for more than 2 centuries, and a third age still to remember how to send one. There was some unknown urgency within him, and even though he supposed that there was no need to hurry, he nonetheless did not fork, deeming it not worth the time to remember how in his rush. Instead, he simply queued up a message to the historian, beginning with a jolt of adrenaline, and began talking. Codrin, Mix Blunt, I really need to talk with you. Like, right now. I need to talk with you right now. Can we meet? It's incredibly urgent. I'm sorry, I know it's late. Can we meet? As soon as he finished, he began pacing once more and waited for a response, doing his level best not to send another sensorium ping immediately to wake Codrin up, just in case. Instead, he walked around the small hill in the center of the clearing, muttering now down to the grass, shouting now up to the sky, half words, half sentences, anything to vent the pressure he felt building inside of him, but there was nothing to be done. When the response finally came, he realized he'd only made it halfway around the hill. Less than a minute must have passed. Time seemed to have stretched itself out long. The response was a mumbled, sleepy-sounding address. Tycho left before his next footfall hit the ground. Low clouds hung above the low house on the short-grass prairie. He forced himself to walk, not run, up to the house where he could already see a light turning on, vague shapes moving behind the glass. The soft chime that announced his arrival led those two shapes, one human, one not, to look up, and before he even made it to the house's door, Codrin was already there, much as he remembered, though much more tired. "Tycho Brahe, yes?" he asked. "Is everything okay?" He tore his eyes away from the figure standing beside the historian, what looked to be some large-eared vulpine standing on 2 legs, looking just as tired as Codrin. Yes," he stammered. "No? I don't think so, at least. I'm sorry for waking you. I don't think things are okay, though." Codrin nodded and stepped aside, gesturing to welcome the astronomer in and guiding him in to a seat at the table. "I will make tea," the fox said, "though I think perhaps one without caffeine." "Who?" "That's my partner, dear, also the tree that was felled." Gears crunched to a halt in his mind, thoughts stalling and whatever words he had prepared scattering. An Otis?" "Yes. Why do you ask?" Tycho knit his brow. "Well, I mean, the history." "I know not all of them came out in the best light," he said, smiling tiredly. "But it's a good one, I promise. Now, can you tell me what's happening?" He forced himself to remain seated at the table, not giving in to the overwhelming urge to pace. "But, I mean, do you remember our conversation years ago? The one about the Dreamer module?" Codrin nodded warily. "That some of the Odists were against it, yes." Then surely you can see my concern, Tycho hissed, leaning toward Codrin. The historian startled back. I'm afraid I don't follow, Dr. Brahe. Can we at least step outside? If you would like me to be elsewhere, Dr. Brahe, I can be, Deer said, standing in the entryway to the kitchen, 3 mugs in his paws. But I do hope that you will trust me. Tycho stared at the fox. It stepped forward, set the 3 mugs down on the table, each smelling of chamomile. You must forgive me for eavesdropping, but I did hear you mention the Dreamer module. I can assure you that I share little in common with the elements of the clade that were against its inclusion. It is not something that I particularly care about, but it is fine, I am sure. I can vouch for it, Codrin said, reaching for her mug but simply holding it in her hands rather than sipping. If we absolutely must step outside, you understand that, as it's my partner, I'll likely tell it about our conversation anyway, yes? After a pause, Tycho's shoulders slumped, and he let out the tension pent up within them. All right. Besides, doesn't sound like there's much use in trying to hide anything from them. Deer rolled its eyes, but sat at the table anyway. You could hide whatever you like from me, Dr. Brahe. I will not look. As you guessed, though, the same is not true of my co-cladists. One of them, perhaps Codrin, willed a cone of silence into being. I read the history, Codrin, he said at last, so I know you know what's on the module. Codrin froze, mug halfway lifted. Deer's ears stood erect, and all sleepiness fled from its features. You understand why I'm concerned, then, right? The historian set her mug back down on the table without taking a sip, saying, Tell me all that you can. So he recounted the events of the previous hour, the sudden interruption of an impersonal message, a simple note from the perisystem architecture informing him, the astronomer on duty, of the signal received. What signal was it? Were the primes echoed back to us? Deer asked. He shook his head and recited from memory. We hear you. We see you. We are 3 light hours, 4 light minutes, 2.043 light seconds out at time of message send, closing at 0.003 c relative velocity. Closest intercept, 5 light minutes, 3.002 light seconds in 972 hours, 8 minutes, 0.33 seconds. We understand the mechanism by which we may meet. We have similar instructions to follow. There was a long moment of silence around the table as the words sank in. The mechanism, Codrin said, finally breaking the silence. It sounded hoarse, unprepared. The Ansible? The instructions for creating a signal that it'll recognize? Tycho stared down into the pale yellow tea. Yes. Did you respond? A furrowed her brow quizzically. Is that even possible? I never thought to ask. The silence fell again, and he could feel the expressions of the other 2 deepen into frowns as he kept his eyes on his tea. Tycho, Deer said, and he couldn't understand how the fox could keep its voice so level. Did you respond? Awaiting consent, he mumbled. That was the last bit of the message. Awaiting consent. You responded. A statement, one spoken with no small amount of awe. You did you not? Yes. What did you send? Codrin said. Consent granted. With the repetition of those words, he pushed the untouched mug of tea further away from him, folded his arms on the table, and rested his forehead on them. The longest silence yet followed as both Deer and Codrin appeared to take this information in, and he, poor, stupid Tycho Brahe, he soaked in his own guilt. It seeped through his clothes, squished in his shoes, matted his hair, and pushed against his face. Tycho Brahe, indeed. He should have chosen the name of some far less competent man all those years ago when he'd first met Codrin. It was the historian who spoke first, voice sounding calm, somewhere between professional and empathetic. An interviewer's voice. Have you told anyone else? No, he said, lifting his head, though still not meeting their gazes. I don't know who I'd tell. Are there no other astronomers working with you? There are. Of course there are. I'm sure they've even read the message by now, and doubtless my response. He shrugged, realizing he'd started crying. But what would I tell them? Extraterrestrials contacted us, asked us to board, and I just said yes? Didn't ask anyone, didn't wait to have a conversation, just up and said yes? Well, okay, Codrin said. Why me, then? We've not spoken in 20 years. Instinct? He said, voice choked with half laughter, half tears. I have no idea, Bălan. You listened to my story back then, and I read your history, and you seemed nice, and I guess you're just always at the center of things." The fox across the table giggled. There was no better way to put it, and there was a tink of ceramic as it bumped its mug to Codrin's. "You, my dear, are so caught up in stardom that even astronomers know your name." None of that amusement showed in her expression as I said, "I am at that, aren't I? Well, Tycho, what are the next steps?" I don't know," he said, finally looking up to the pair, to Deer's grin and Codrin's frown. "I was hoping you'd know." He sighed, leaned over, and patted him on the shoulder. "Well, since I'm sure as hell not sleeping anymore, I guess coffee's next. Coffee and figuring out what to do with our wayward astronomer and upcoming guests." That was the first chapter of Nevi'im, Book 3 of the Post-Self Cycle. You can find the book at nevi'im.post-self.inc, and you can find the rest of the books and much more information on the series at post-self.inc. Again, my name's Madison Scott Clary, author of the book, and thank you so much for peeking in today for the launch of Nevi'im.